At 3:00 a.m., flashing red and blue lights lit up Colorado Springs as over 300 officers from the DEA, ICE, and local police stormed a nightclub that had been hiding in plain sight. By the time the music stopped, 115 people were in custody, and what agents found inside would shake the entire city. Among the detainees were 17 active-duty U.S. military members, and 8 of them weren't there to party. They were reportedly working as security guarding the doors, while drugs, cash, and prostitution moved just feet away. For the people of Colorado Springs, a city known for its proud military bases and quiet suburbs, the news hit like a thunderclap. Federal agents described the scene as chaotic streets, sealed helicopters overhead, suspects zip-tied and lined up against walls. But behind the flashing lights and broken doors lay something far bigger than a nightclub bust. This was a command post for organized crime, a criminal hub protected by people trained to defend the nation. Tonight, we go inside, the moment when DEA and ICE uncovered one of the most shocking infiltrations in American history, and what it revealed about the growing shadow inside the ranks. It began quietly under the cover of darkness. At 3:00 a.m., federal and local law enforcement converged on the intersection of South Academy Boulevard and Airport Road in Colorado Springs. The nightclub looked like any other neon lights, flashing cars lined along the block base, pounding through the walls. But what no one knew was that for months this very building had been under surveillance by the DEA, ICE, and the Colorado Springs Police Department. What started as a local nuisance complaint had evolved into a full-scale federal operation. By the time the command was given to move in, over 300 officers from more than 10 agencies had surrounded the area. Streets were sealed, traffic was diverted, and helicopters hovered low enough to rattle windows. Agents in tactical gear poured through the club's entrance in synchronized waves. The crowd inside barely had time to react before music cut off, and floodlights turned night into day. Witnesses described chaos, people shouting, glasses breaking, and officers shouting commands in both English and Spanish. Within minutes, the operation was fully underway. Agents lined detainees along the walls, zip-tying wrists, as others swept the rooms. The sound of the club's speakers was replaced by the rustle of handcuffs and radios. According to federal reports, 115 individuals were detained that night, making it one of the largest nightclub raids in Colorado history. What stunned the agents wasn't just the number, it was the makeup of the crowd. Amid the chaos, agents began noticing military bags, camouflage jackets, and ID tags. At first, they assumed they belonged to veterans or off-duty soldiers enjoying a night out. But as the raid continued, the truth began to unfold. Among those detained were 17 active-duty military personnel, some stationed at Fort Carson and Peterson Space Force Base, and 8 of them agents, later confirmed, were working as security inside the club. Outside, the streets of Colorado Springs filled with stunned bystanders, many recording on their phones, as officers escorted detainees into waiting buses. Federal vans marked with DEA and ICE logos lined the block as evidence teams began collecting documents, cash, and narcotics from inside the building. For residents, the scene felt surreal, the kind of thing that happens in cartel-heavy border cities, not in a community surrounded by military bases. As dawn broke over the city, federal officials briefed the media. What had appeared to be just another illegal nightclub was in fact a hub for organized crime, complete with its own guards, financial handlers, and links to international trafficking networks. For the DEA, this wasn't just a raid, it was a message. Organized crime was no longer hiding in the shadows of America's borders. It was thriving in plain sight inside a city that represented discipline, patriotism, and order. When the DEA began reviewing arrest records from the raid, one detail stood out immediately. 17 of the detainees were active-duty U.S. military personnel. What shocked investigators even more was that 8 of them had been serving as security inside the nightclub, not as partygoers. They were guarding entrances, screening customers, and monitoring surveillance feeds while drugs, cash, and prostitution circulated just feet away. It wasn't an accident or coincidence. These soldiers were part of the operation's daily function. Agents described the revelation as a gut punch to the American uniform. Colorado Springs, home to Fort Carson-Peterson, Space Force Base, and the U.S. Air Force Academy, has long been known as a city where military pride runs deep. Seeing service members, men and women sworn to uphold the law working for a criminal network, shook the community to its core. In one room, agents found tactical gear labeled with the soldier's name tag. In another, they found a list of rotating shifts for door staff, half of whom turned out to be enlisted personnel. The nightclub hadn't just hired muscle, it had recruited discipline command and tactical structure from within the ranks. According to DEA sources, these service members were not random hires. The club's operators deliberately targeted military personnel, offering fast cash for off-duty protection work. Some were allegedly recruited through mutual acquaintances who promised easy weekend security gigs. What they weren't told or chose to ignore was that they'd be standing guard over an illegal enterprise connected to drug distribution and human trafficking. One agent later said, "These weren't mercenaries from the outside. These were trained soldiers, and they were guarding the enemy from within." As details emerged, the Department of Defense launched its own internal investigation, working alongside the DEA and ICE Homeland Security investigations. Officials wanted to know how far the infiltration reached. Were these soldiers simply freelancing for extra income, or had criminal networks successfully breached the military's moral and operational walls? The question sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and national security circles. Federal prosecutors are now exploring whether this was an isolated case or part of a broader trend. In recent years, organized crime groups have been documented attempting to recruit military veterans and reservists for their skills in logistics, weapon handling, and crowd control. For cartels and traffickers, soldiers bring something money can't buy easily: training, discipline, and credibility. The Colorado Springs raid may have just exposed how deep that strategy has already gone. One of the most disturbing findings was that several of the soldiers allegedly used their access to military facilities to obtain equipment, radio gear, flashlights, and in some cases tactical vests identical to those used by police. The presence of such gear inside the nightclub blurred the line between authority and criminality. Witnesses told investigators that the soldiers' professionalism gave the club a sense of legitimacy. Patrons felt safe because the military guys were in charge. That illusion of security made the criminal operation nearly untouchable until federal agents stormed the doors. The DEA later confirmed that all 17 service members are under investigation, and 8 have already been suspended from duty pending disciplinary hearings. Meanwhile, military intelligence officers are examining whether any of the suspects had prior connections to known trafficking networks. Officials say the implications are serious. If criminal groups can buy loyalty from within the armed forces, they gain more than manpower. They gain access, structure, and protection. For a city that prides itself on service and sacrifice, the fallout has been painful. The image of soldiers in handcuffs escorted out of a club under flashing lights became a symbol of betrayal. As one veteran told reporters, "It wasn't just a raid, it was a reminder that corruption doesn't need to sneak in. Sometimes it's already wearing a uniform." For months before the raid, the nightclub sat in plain view on a busy stretch of South Academy Boulevard, flashing neon lights, long lines, and booming music that blended into the city's nightlife. To most people in Colorado Springs, it was just another late-night venue, one of dozens that catered to soldiers, students, and locals looking for a drink after hours. But beneath the surface, the DEA had been quietly watching. What they discovered was not a party scene, but a criminal infrastructure operating under cover of entertainment. The nightclub had become what federal agents called a command post for organized crime, a place where drugs, human trafficking, forged IDs, and illegal financial activity all converged. It wasn't a single crime ring. It was multiple networks overlapping in one location. Agents traced connections between the club's operators and known traffickers in Texas, New Mexico, and California, suggesting that the site served as a distribution and recruitment hub. Each weekend, cash flowed in by the thousands, money that investigators say was later funneled through shell accounts and digital transfers to hide its origin. According to law enforcement records, the venue had racked up over 170 police calls in a single year, more than any other establishment in the city. Fights spilled into parking lots. Unregistered cars came and went at all hours, and noise complaints were constant. Yet, each time police responded, the club managed to avoid serious charges. When inspectors arrived, ownership paperwork changed hands. When authorities shut it down, it reopened under a new name in another building within weeks. The operators knew the playbook: move fast, stay public, and never act secretive enough to raise alarm. It worked for nearly 2 years. By late 2023, intelligence from ICE Homeland Security investigations suggested that the club wasn't just a hotspot, it was part of an international trafficking network. Surveillance footage captured exchanges of small packages between vehicles behind the building and coded conversations referencing tickets and escorts, which investigators later identified as slang for narcotics and human movement. Informants told federal agents that women from Latin America were being rotated through the club for special events, an indicator of organized prostitution tied to cross-border exploitation. Inside the operation was designed to look legitimate. Bouncers checked IDs, bartenders were licensed, and tax records showed consistent payments. Everything on paper looked normal, but agents learned that much of the staff had fake documentation and that the club's manager was already wanted for money laundering in Texas. Beneath the dance floor, they found a hidden office equipped with surveillance monitors and safes used to store cash. Forensic teams later discovered that multiple credit card terminals in the bar had been modified to skim customer data, another income stream for the network. What made this operation especially dangerous, investigators said, was its audacity. The criminals weren't hiding in a warehouse or a remote compound. They were operating under strobe lights and music, surrounded by hundreds of people every night. It was organized crime disguised as nightlife, an empire built behind liquor bottles and sound systems. When the raid finally came in October 2024, federal agents didn't just take down a nightclub. They dismantled the heartbeat of a regional trafficking network, one that stretched from Colorado to the southern border and beyond. The shocking part wasn't how big the operation was, it was how confidently it had existed right in front of everyone's eyes. When the lights came back on and the music stopped, chaos turned into silence. Federal agents began processing the 115 detainees one by one, separating civilians from potential suspects and collecting identification. What they discovered revealed the true scope of the operation. Out of everyone detained that night, 105 individuals could not provide proof of legal status in the United States. By dawn, those detainees were handed over to ICE custody, where they remain under federal review. The list of nationalities read like a map of Latin America: Guatemala, Cuba, El Salvador, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, Chile, and Honduras. Each name represented more than a single arrest. It was another connection in a web stretching far beyond Colorado Springs, reaching into international trafficking pipelines that had been quietly feeding off the American underground economy. DEA sources described the club as a melting pot of organized crime, where local gangs, cartel couriers, and international recruiters met under flashing lights. It wasn't just nightlife, it was business diplomacy and crime all rolled into one. Agents quickly realized this wasn't just about narcotics or prostitution. Inside the group of detainees were individuals flagged by multiple federal databases. 2 were fugitives wanted for violent crimes in other states. Several others matched identifiers connected to prior human trafficking cases. For law enforcement, the nightclub had effectively become a safe zone for criminals, a space where fugitives could blend in, where traffickers could recruit new workers, and where illegal profits could circulate freely. Investigators later revealed that the nightclub was used to move people as much as product. ICE officials explained that some of the detained individuals had been working off debts owed to smuggling networks. They were promised legitimate jobs upon arrival in the U.S., but instead found themselves trapped inside a system that used nightclubs as labor funnels, forcing them to work for pennies while generating huge profits for those in control. One official described it bluntly. It was modern slavery under neon lights. For the community, the aftermath was difficult to process. Many residents of Colorado Springs had no idea such a network could exist in a city known for its military bases and suburban calm. The sheer number of detainees stunned locals. Families watched as federal buses lined up across South Academy Boulevard, loading handcuffed suspects in waves. The scene felt more like a military operation than a police raid, and in some ways it was. As investigations unfolded, ICE began coordinating with international partners across Latin America to trace the origins of the trafficking routes connected to those detained. Early findings showed that several of the suspects had entered the country through southern border crossings using forged asylum documents. Others arrived legally, but overstayed visas quickly absorbed into underground labor systems that fed places like the nightclub. Inside federal holding facilities, interviews with detainees painted a chilling picture of how organized crime exploits immigration loopholes. Some said they were recruited through WhatsApp groups promising cash jobs in the U.S. nightlife industry. Others described being forced to pay protection fees to remain employed at the club. They lived in crowded apartments nearby, often with their pay withheld. Federal agents now believe that the Colorado Springs nightclub was just one node in a much larger trafficking web, one that uses entertainment venues across the country to blend illegal activity into everyday American life. It's a perfect disguise, one DEA agent said. Drugs, money, and people all moving in plain sight. When questioned about the arrests, a spokesperson for ICE summarized the raid in one sentence. This wasn't a nightclub. It was an intersection where immigration crime, organized trafficking, and national security all collided. By the following morning, the images from the Colorado Springs nightclub raid had already spread nationwide, flashing lights, helicopters, and rows of suspects lined up outside a club that once pulsed with music. But what came next would reach far beyond one city. The DEA, ICE, and Department of Defense were now forced to confront a question that struck at the heart of American security. How deep had organized crime already reached into the country's most trusted institutions? In a press briefing 2 days after the raid, DEA Special Agent in Charge Michael Cervantes called the operation a clear warning to every network operating under the illusion of safety. He emphasized that this wasn't just about nightlife crime. It was about infiltration. We're not dealing with street dealers anymore, he said. We're dealing with professional organizations that understand recruitment discipline and control, and they're learning from us. Behind the scenes, the Department of Defense moved quickly to open its own parallel investigation. Military police from Fort Carson and counterintelligence officers from the Army Criminal Investigation Division began questioning the 17 active duty members identified in the raid. Their goal wasn't just to punish individuals, it was to find out whether cartel-linked networks were deliberately targeting service members for recruitment. Early reports suggest that the club had become a local hub where soldiers could be lured into side work that gradually turned into participation in trafficking operations. Some were offered $500 to $1,000 a night to serve as armed guards while others were promised a cut from drug or cash shipments. The ICE Homeland Security Investigations Unit also launched a multi-state sweep following leads connected to the 105 detainees still in custody. Immigration analysts identified overlapping travel records, repeated sponsor addresses, and falsified employment histories, indicators of an organized system for moving people across states to staff underground clubs, warehouses, and illegal grow houses. Agents now believe the Colorado Springs raid exposed only one part of a much larger machine. As federal prosecutors began assembling charges, the case was divided into three categories: organized crime and narcotics trafficking, human trafficking and labor exploitation, and military corruption and security breach. Each carries penalties of up to 20 years in federal prison. Officials say indictments could begin as early as January 2025. Uniform or not, one DEA agent said if you guard a criminal network, you become part of it. For Colorado Springs, the aftermath has been both emotional and unsettling. Residents who once viewed their city as a sanctuary of discipline and honor now speak of betrayal. Local veterans organizations released statements condemning the involvement of active duty personnel, while families of soldiers demanded answers from base leadership. One retired colonel put it simply, "If the cartel can reach into our ranks, then we have more than a crime problem. We have a national security problem." The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Colorado has since confirmed that additional raids may follow in Denver, Pueblo, and Aurora, targeting clubs believed to have similar structures. Federal task forces are also reviewing unsolved trafficking cases tied to Colorado's Interstate 25 corridor, where organized networks may have used military transport routes as cover. The scale of the response signals that this case has become a template for how the U.S. government plans to confront hybrid threats where crime, corruption, and infiltration merge. As one federal official put it, Colorado Springs is not the story of one raid, it's the story of a warning. Organized crime doesn't just adapt, it learns. And this time it learned how to wear a uniform. When the flashing lights faded from Colorado Springs, the questions only grew louder. How could a nightclub in the middle of America become a front for international crime, guarded by active-duty soldiers and packed with over 100 undocumented workers? The raid may be over, but the investigation has only begun. Federal agents now believe the operation uncovered a template, a model for how cartels and criminal syndicates are embedding themselves into American life. One neighborhood, one business, one soldier at a time. The DEA and ICE called it one of the most significant operations of the decade, not just because of what was seized, but because of what it revealed: a system that no longer hides in the shadows, but dances under flashing lights. For the United States, this was more than a raid. It was a reality check, proof that infiltration no longer starts at the border. It starts from within. And while Colorado Springs now sleeps a little less soundly, one truth remains clear: the next operation has already begun. Stay tuned. This is Federal Raid Files, where every light we turn on exposes another shadow America didn't know it had.